The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, sharpening the frozen tears that refused to fall. It tore across the wagon boards, a constant, keening sound that promised only more hardship, a prelude to the profound and desolate silence of the peaks ahead. Beside her, huddled under a single threadbare blanket, her children were small, still shapes of misery. Caleb, at 10, stared straight ahead, his jaw set with a man's resolve in a boy's face. Leah, 2 years younger, had her face buried in Alara's side, her small shudders a rhythm of fear against her mother's ribs. And Samuel, barely 4, slept a fitful, fevered sleep in her lap, his breath a fragile puff of white in the biting air. They were all she had left of a life that had been dismantled piece by piece, first by blight, then by fever, and finally by the cold pragmatism of a town that had no room for a widow and her 3 hungry children. Reverend Miller, driving the buckboard, had not spoken more than a dozen words since they left the gray, smoke-stained hamlet of Providence. His silence was a judgment in itself, a heavy stone of condemnation for her poverty, for her inability to simply disappear. The deal had been struck in the dim light of his office, the words clinical and swift. A man, a recluse, was dying in the high country. A giant of a man, they said, felled by a grizzly and the subsequent infection that was now rotting him from the inside out. He needed a caretaker for his final weeks. In exchange for this grim service, his cabin and his claim would pass to her. It was not a gift of charity, but a transaction of flesh. She was to watch a stranger die so that her children might live. The very air grew thinner as the wagon clawed its way higher, the pines closing in like sentinels of a forgotten world. The scent of damp earth and snow replaced the familiar wood smoke of the town. This was a place of isolation, a place people were exiled to, not a place they chose. Despair, a cold and familiar companion, settled deeper into Alara's bones. She had bartered herself, not for gold or comfort, but for a roof over her children's heads, a final, desperate gamble against a winter that would have otherwise claimed them. She pulled the blanket tighter around Leah, her own body a poor shield against the encroaching cold. She looked at Caleb's rigid profile, the weight of the world already settling on his young shoulders. What life was this? To be handed over like chattel, to preside over a death watch in a wilderness that cared for nothing and no one. The wagon lurched to a halt, the squeal of the brake a final, jarring note in the oppressive quiet. "This is it," the Reverend said, his voice flat. Before them stood a cabin, brutal in its simplicity, hewn from massive logs that seemed to have been placed by a force of nature rather than by human hands. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the mountain itself. Smoke, thin and pale, curled from a stone chimney, a sign of the fading life within. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were here, in the cold shadow of the cabin, at the edge of a man's life and the terrifying beginning of their own. Alara pushed the heavy oak door inward, the groan of the hinges like a cry of protest. The air that met them was thick with the scent of pine smoke, stale sweat, and something else, something metallic and sweet that spoke of sickness and decay. Her stomach tightened. The cabin's interior was a single, cavernous room, dominated by a stone hearth where embers glowed with a defeated, sullen light. The sparse furniture, a rough-hewn table, 2 stools, shelves laden with tins and bundled herbs, was built to a scale that made her feel like a child in a giant's house. And there, on a pallet of furs near the fire, was the giant himself. The stories had not been an exaggeration. He was immense, a mountain of a man even when laid low. A tangle of dark, matted hair and a thick beard obscured most of his face, but what she could see was pale and drawn tight with fever. A crude bandage, stained dark, was wrapped around his thigh, and the smell of corruption emanated from it. His breathing was a harsh, ragged saw, each inhalation a struggle against the weight of his own body and the poison in his blood. The children clustered behind her skirts, their small hands clutching the fabric of her dress. Samuel began to whimper, a thin, frightened sound that seemed impossibly loud in the charged silence. Caleb's eyes were wide, fixed on the formidable shape on the floor. Reverend Miller remained at the threshold, unwilling to step fully into the chamber of death. "He has provisions," the Reverend stated, his gaze fixed somewhere over Ilara's shoulder. "Dried meat, flour, beans. The well is out back. The wood is stacked. You are to tend to him. When it is over, the cabin is yours." The words were a final severing. He placed a small sack of cornmeal and salt pork on the floor just inside the door, a last token of the town's grim bargain. He did not say goodbye. He simply turned, and the sound of his wagon retreating was the sound of their last bridge to the world being burned away. They were alone. Ilara stood for a long moment, the silence descending like a shroud. The only sounds were the rasp of the dying man's breath and the frantic beating of her own heart. This was her new home. This stranger, this husk of a man, was her charge. She moved, her actions stiff and deliberate, a defense against the paralysis of fear. First, the children. She settled them on the far side of the room, as far from the sickbed as possible, wrapping them in their meager blanket and speaking in a low, soothing whisper she did not feel. Then she turned her attention to the man. Her duty. She knelt cautiously beside the pallet. Up close, his sheer size was overwhelming. His hands, resting on the furs, were broad as shovels, the knuckles scarred and calloused. A tremor ran through his massive frame, a testament to the fever that raged within him. He was dying. It was plain to see, and a part of her, the desperate, terrified part, whispered that it would be better if it happened quickly. But another part, the part that had kept her children alive this long, the part that was a healer by instinct if not by training, looked at the soiled bandage and the raging fever and saw only a task to be done. A life to be fought for, even if it was a life she was meant only to usher out of the world. With trembling hands, she reached for the bucket of water near the hearth. Her work had begun. The first days blurred into a grueling cycle of survival. Ilara's world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. Her focus narrowed to the two critical fronts of her war, keeping her children safe and keeping the stranger alive. The man, Silas, drifted in and out of a fevered delirium. He would murmur unintelligible words, his massive body racked with shudders that shook the very floorboards. At other times, he lay so still, his breathing so shallow, that Ilara would press her fingers to the thick column of his neck, searching for the thrum of life, her own breath held in suspense. Her first task was to face the wound. Steeling herself, she unwrapped the foul bandage. The sight beneath made her flinch, a wave of nausea rising in her throat. The flesh was angry and swollen, the deep gashes from the bear's claws weeping a sickly fluid. The infection was deep. Without lancing and cleaning it, the poison would surely take him. She found a small, sharp skinning knife among his possessions and held it in the fire until the tip glowed orange. Her hands shook, not from fear of him, but from the terrible intimacy of the act. He was unconscious, his body a dead weight, but as she pressed the heated blade to the worst of the swelling, a guttural groan was torn from his chest. His eyes flew open. They were a startling, pale gray like a winter sky, and for a moment, they were lucid, burning with a raw, agonizing awareness. He did not fight her. He simply stared, his gaze locking with hers as she worked, draining the wound with a desperate, methodical focus. She cleaned it with boiled water and potent, bitter-smelling herbs she found hanging from the rafters, her movements precise and sure. When she was done, she bound it with clean strips of linen torn from her own spare petticoat. His eyes had closed again, but his breathing, though still labored, seemed a fraction less ragged. She fed him broth, spooning the warm liquid between his cracked lips. She kept the fire roaring, pushing back the relentless chill of the mountain. She organized his supplies, discovering a well-stocked larder that spoke of a man who understood solitude and long winters. There were sacks of flour, beans, dried apples, and smoked venison hanging from the ceiling. He was a man who planned to live, even if he was now failing at it. The children watched her, their fear slowly giving way to a quiet awe. Caleb, seeing her exhaustion, began to help without being asked. He hauled buckets of water from the well, his small frame straining with the effort. He learned to chop kindling with a hatchet, his swings clumsy at first, then growing more confident. Leah took on the care of Samuel, telling him quiet stories and ensuring he stayed by the hearth. They were becoming a unit, a small, determined clan fighting against the wilderness and the specter of death that lay on the pallet of furs. Silas, in his fevered state, became less a man and more a part of the landscape of their lives, a human mountain at the center of their new territory. Ilara tended to him with a detached efficiency, yet she found herself noticing the details of him. The way a scar cut through one dark eyebrow, the sheer, raw power in his shoulders, even when slack with illness. She wondered about the life that had led him here, to this isolated peak, to die alone. She felt no affection, only a grim sense of responsibility. This was her bargain. She would hold up her end. She would fight the death that hovered in the corners of the room, because his life was inextricably bound to the future of her children. Slowly, painstakingly, the fever began to break. The turning point came on the 5th night, a night when the wind howled like a hungry wolf outside the cabin walls and the temperature plummeted. The man's shivers became violent, his teeth chattering in a bone-jarring rhythm. Ilara piled every fur and blanket she could find onto him, but the cold was coming from within, a deep, septic chill. Desperate, she brewed the strongest willow bark tea she dared, forcing the bitter liquid past his lips. She sat by his side all night, bathing his face with cool water when the fever spiked, holding his hand when the tremors became too severe. It was a strange and unnerving thing, to feel her small hand enveloped in his massive one, to feel the latent strength in that grip even in his weakness. Sometime before dawn, the shivering stopped. A profound stillness settled over him. His forehead, when she touched it, was cool and damp. His breathing evened out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of true sleep. She watched him for an hour, her heart a cautious drum in the silence, before allowing herself to believe it. He had passed through the crucible. He would live. The next day he was awake. His gray eyes, now clear and startlingly intelligent, followed her as she moved about the cabin. He did not speak, but his gaze was a palpable weight. It was not threatening but appraising, watchful. Ilara felt a new kind of tension settle in the small space. Before, he had been a patient, an object of her care. Now he was a man, a stranger of immense size and unknown temperament, and they were trapped in this cabin together. She continued her routine, trying to ignore the intensity of his stare. She served him broth, and for the first time, he reached out and took the bowl from her, his movements slow but deliberate. His fingers brushed hers, the touch calloused and surprisingly gentle. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. "The wound," he finally said. His voice was a revelation, a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It was the first word he had spoken to her in lucidity. "You cleaned it." It was not a question but a statement of fact. "It was poisoned," she replied, her own voice sounding thin and uncertain. "It had to be done," he nodded slowly, his eyes drifting from her face to the new, clean bandage on his leg. He looked around the cabin, at the neatly stacked wood by the hearth, the organized shelves, the pot of stew simmering over the fire. His gaze finally settled on the children, who were playing quietly with stones near the door. Caleb met his look for a beat, his expression one of defiant curiosity, before looking away. Silas's eyes lingered on them, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He was taking stock of the invasion, of the woman and her 3 small offspring who had appeared at his deathbed and refused to let him die. The power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer just his caretaker. She was an interloper, and he was no longer a dying man. He was the master of this house, and his recovery posed a question as terrifying as his death. What would he do with them now? A storm descended upon the mountain, burying the cabin in a world of swirling white. For 3 days, the snow fell without ceasing, erasing the path, the trees, the sky itself. They were utterly sealed in, the 6-foot drifts pressing against the door, the windows turning into opaque squares of frost. The world outside ceased to exist. Inside, a fragile, unspoken truce took hold. The storm forced a proximity that was both a comfort and a trial. The cabin, once a cavernous space, now felt small, crowded with the weight of 5 lives and the unspoken anxieties that hung in the air. Silas was gaining strength with astonishing speed. He was soon able to sit up, his back against the wall, his long legs stretching halfway across the room. He rarely spoke, but he watched everything. He watched Alara knead bread, her movements efficient and practiced. He watched her mend Caleb's worn trousers with neat, small stitches. He watched the way she rationed their food, ensuring the children always had enough, her own portion smaller. His silence was not empty. It was absorbent, observant. He was learning them. The crisis came on the 2nd day of the storm. Little Samuel, always the most fragile, developed a cough. By nightfall, it had deepened into a rattling, chest-seizing affliction, and his skin was hot to the touch. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's weary composure. She knew this cough, had heard it in the village before the fever took hold. She put him to bed, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, but his breathing grew more labored, each gasp a painful wheeze. She sat beside him, helpless, the limitations of her knowledge a terrifying reality. In the dim firelight, Silas shifted. "The box!" he rasped, his voice still rough from disuse. He gestured with his chin toward a small, locked chest in the corner. One Alara had assumed held valuables. "The key is on the mantel." Alara retrieved the small iron key and opened the chest. Inside, nestled in dried moss, were not coins or deeds, but dozens of small, carefully labeled bundles of herbs and roots, along with glass vials of tinctures. It was an apothecary's collection. "Mullein," he said, pointing a large finger. "And the one that smells of mint. Make a tea." A few drops of the dark liquid from the blue bottle. His instructions were precise, confident. She did as he commanded, her hands moving with renewed purpose. She brewed the tea, its steam filling the cabin with a pungent, medicinal aroma. She held Samuel, propping him up, and helped him sip the warm, potent brew. For the first time since their arrival, Silas had offered not just his presence, but his knowledge. He had intervened. He had guided her. He had helped. All through the night, she and Silas kept a silent vigil. He did not sleep, his gray eyes tracking the small rise and fall of Samuel's chest from across the room. It was a shared watch, a silent partnership forged in the crucible of a child's fever. By morning, Samuel's breathing was easier, the fire in his small body banked to a low ember. He was weak, but he would recover. Alara looked over at Silas, her eyes conveying a gratitude too deep for words. He met her gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Something had shifted between them in the storm-locked cabin. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of trust. He had seen her competence, her fierce devotion to her children, and she had seen his wisdom, a hidden well of knowledge about the mountain and its remedies. He was not just a brute force of nature. He was a part of this place, and in saving her son, he had subtly, irrevocably, woven their lives into his. As the snows began to melt and the first tentative signs of spring touched the high country, a new rhythm established itself in the cabin. The oppressive tension of the early days gave way to a quiet, functional coexistence. Silas was now moving about, his limp pronounced but his strength returning with a formidable vitality. He was a man of immense physical presence, and his every action was deliberate and economical. He chopped a winter's worth of wood in a single morning, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat in their valley. He repaired the leaking roof, reset a loose stone in the hearth, and mended the harness Alara had thought beyond saving. He worked with a silent, focused intensity, restoring order to the small world he had almost left behind. He did not offer conversation, but he began to teach. He never addressed Alara directly with his lessons, but would speak to Caleb while knowing she was listening. He showed the boy how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits in the damp earth, how to set snares along their trails, how to tell which mushrooms were safe and which were poison. He took a piece of pine and, with a few deft movements of his knife, carved a small, perfect wolf for Samuel, its wooden form fitting smoothly in the child's hand. Samuel, who had been the most terrified of the silent giant, now toddled after him, watching him with wide, curious eyes. Leah, ever quiet and watchful, would leave him a cup of water on the stump where he split wood, a silent offering he would acknowledge with a slight dip of his head. They were orbiting him, this man who was neither their father nor their master, but who had become the solid center of their precarious lives. Alara found herself watching him, too. She saw the way his hands, capable of splitting a log with one blow, could be so precise in carving the delicate ear of a wooden animal. She saw the way his eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when he watched Samuel play, a flicker of warmth in their cool gray depths. She learned his habits. The way he would stand at the door at sunrise, staring out at the peaks as if in communion with them. The quiet sigh he would let out after a meal, a sound of simple, profound contentment. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the necessities of the day. The corn is low, I will hunt tomorrow. The well needs a new rope. Their communication was built of shared tasks and understood needs, a language of action rather than words. Yet, in this shared silence, a deeper understanding was growing. She was no longer just the woman sent to watch him die. She was the woman who had saved him, the woman who kept his home, who cared for the children who were now a permanent fixture within it. And he was no longer the dying stranger. He was the provider, the protector, the quiet, formidable force that kept the wilderness at bay. The cabin had become a home, not by declaration, but by the slow, steady accretion of shared days, shared meals, and shared silence. It was a fragile peace, a life built on an unspoken agreement, but it was more than Alara had ever dared to hope for. Caleb was the first to bridge the chasm of silence. He had become Silas's shadow, his young face a mask of concentration as he absorbed every lesson the mountain man offered. He learned to track, to fish with a simple line and hook, to identify the calls of different birds. He was a boy starved for a father's guidance, and he drank in Silas's quiet knowledge like a thirsty plant. One afternoon, Silas returned from a day of checking his trap lines, a heavy brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He'd also found a bee tree and carried a honeycomb dripping with amber liquid, a rare and precious treat. He set his bounty on the table without a word, as was his way. The children's eyes went wide at the sight of the honey. Alara felt a smile touch her own lips, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. It was such a simple offering, yet it felt like a gift of immense value. As Alara began to prepare the rabbits for stew, Caleb stood near the table, watching Silas clean his knife. The boy had something on his mind. It was clear in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked at Silas's broad back, at the quiet competence of his movements. He saw not just a provider, but a bastion of strength, a figure who had filled the terrifying void left by his own father's death. Finally, he drew a breath. "Can I help you skin them, Pa?" The word fell into the quiet cabin with the weight of a stone. "Bah!" It hung in the air, electric and fragile. Alara froze, her own knife still. Leah and Samuel, playing by the fire, fell silent, their heads turning. The entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Silas's hands stopped their work. He did not turn. His back, a vast expanse of muscle beneath his linen shirt, remained to them. For a long, agonizing moment, he was perfectly still, a statue carved from mountain granite. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She feared she had misread everything, that this boyish plea had crossed an invisible line, that it would shatter the delicate peace they had built. She feared a rebuke, a harsh correction that would wound Caleb deeper than any physical blow. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Then Silas moved. He did not speak. He simply took one of the rabbits and a smaller skinning knife and placed them on a stool beside him. He gestured for Caleb to come closer. The boy approached, his expression a mixture of terror and hope. Silas began to work again, his large hands moving slowly, deliberately, showing Caleb where to make the first cut, how to work the hide free without tearing it. He still did not speak the word, did not acknowledge it aloud. But in that simple, silent invitation, he accepted it completely. He had allowed the boy in. He had answered. Alara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, a profound sense of relief washing over her. She turned back to her own work, her hands trembling slightly. It was more than an acceptance of a name. It was an acceptance of a role. The bargain made in desperation with the town of Providence was void. A new covenant had been forged in this cabin, a silent one, sealed not with words, but with a boy's hope and a man's quiet consent. The world intruded on their sanctuary on a warm day in late summer. The air was thick with the scent of pine and sun-baked earth when the sound of approaching horses broke the valley's peace. Alara was outside, hanging laundry on a line strung between two pines, when she saw them, 3 riders emerging from the tree line. Her blood ran cold. One of the men she recognized instantly, Jennings, the nephew of Reverend Miller. He was a man with a reputation for greed and a cruel sort of cunning, and his presence here could mean no good. As they rode into the clearing, their confident smirks told her they were not here for a social call. They dismounted, their movements arrogant, taking in the cabin, the neat stack of firewood, the small patch of vegetables Alara had planted. Their eyes lingered on her, insolent and appraising. "Well, well," Jennings said, his voice slick with false piety. "The widow Alara. It seems you've made yourself quite at home." The cabin door opened and Silas filled the frame. He had been inside, sharpening an axe head. He stood there, silent and immense, the heavy axe held loosely in one hand. His presence immediately altered the atmosphere. Jennings's smirk faltered for a moment, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the man who was supposed to be dead. He quickly recovered. "Silas, a surprise to see you on your feet. The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his tone dripping with insincerity. "We've come on town business, a matter of the claim." "There is no business," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that carried an unmistakable threat. "This is my land." "Was your land?" Jennings corrected, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "The agreement, as Reverend Miller recorded it, was that the widow would care for you in your final days, after which the property would be hers, but under the stewardship of the town council until her eldest boy comes of age. Seeing as you inconveniently recovered, that agreement is null. And since you were derelict on your taxes while you were indisposed, the town has repossessed the claim. It was a lie, a transparent and cruel fabrication." But Jennings held the paper, the symbol of a law that did not exist in these mountains but could be brutally enforced by men like him. His 2 companions shifted, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts. They had come expecting to intimidate a lone woman and her children. The giant in the doorway was an obstacle, but they clearly believed he was one they could overcome. Alara's heart pounded with a cold, terrifying dread. She saw the life she had painstakingly built about to be torn away. She saw her children, now healthy and secure, being cast out into the wilderness once more. She moved to stand slightly behind Silas, a silent declaration of allegiance. Caleb, Leah, and Samuel appeared in the doorway behind their mother, their small faces pale with fear. They were a family, arrayed against the encroaching darkness. "This is her home now," Silas stated, his voice flat, final. "And mine. You are not welcome here." Leave. Jennings laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Is that so? This land is worth a fair bit with the timber on it. We're not leaving without it. Now, you can step aside, or we can move you." One of Jennings's men drew his pistol, leveling it at Silas's chest. The air crackled with imminent violence. The quiet life they had forged was about to be shattered. The man's pistol was a black, unblinking eye in the afternoon sun. Alara's breath caught in her throat, a choked, silent scream. She instinctively pushed Caleb and Leah further behind her, shielding them with her body. But Silas did not flinch. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood there, his gray eyes fixed on Jennings, ignoring the gunman entirely. The stillness in him was more terrifying than any outward display of rage. It was the calm at the center of a storm, the deep, terrible silence before an avalanche. You think that thing changes anything? Silas's voice was unnervingly calm, a low growl that vibrated with contained power. You think a piece of lead can take what you want from me? He took a single, deliberate step forward, off the cabin's threshold and onto the packed earth of the yard. The man with the gun shuffled nervously, his aim wavering. I was a dying man when she came here, Silas continued, his gaze never leaving Jennings's face. This mountain had already half-claimed me. I had nothing left to live for. I was waiting for the end. He gestured with the hand holding the axe, a subtle movement that encompassed Alara and the children huddled behind her. And then they came. She fought death in my own house and she won. That boy, he nodded towards Caleb. He called me Pa. You understand what that means? It means this is my family. This is my land. And you will not take it from them. Jennings's face twisted in a sneer of disbelief and anger. You old fool. You die for this pauper and her brats. I was already dead, Silas said simply. They brought me back. I will not let you undo their work. In that moment, before any violence had truly erupted, Alara knew they had already won. The man before her was not the same one she had found shivering with fever. That man had been an outcast, a recluse waiting for his final release. This man was a husband, a father. He was rooted to this place not just by a claim on a piece of paper, but by the fierce, primal instinct to protect his own. The gunman, emboldened by Jennings's glare, took a step forward. Put the axe down, old man. Silas shifted his weight. The movement was deceptively fast. In one fluid motion, he swung the axe, not at the man, but at a thick chopping block nearby. The heavy head bit deep into the wood with a sickening thunk that echoed through the clearing. He let go, leaving the axe quivering in the block. Then he lunged. He moved with a speed that was shocking for a man of his size. He ignored the pistol, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He grabbed the gunman's wrist with one hand, twisting it with brutal efficiency. There was a sharp crack of bone, and the man screamed, the pistol clattering to the ground. With his other hand, Silas seized the man by his collar and lifted him from his feet, holding him aloft as if he were a sack of grain, before throwing him contemptuously aside. The second man, fumbling for his own weapon, was met with a backhanded blow that sent him sprawling into the dirt, dazed and sputtering. Silas turned his full attention to Jennings. He did not rush. He walked slowly, deliberately, his shadow falling over the smaller man. Jennings, his face ashen, scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet. He was a creature of bluffs and paperwork, utterly unprepared for this raw, elemental force. Silas stood over him, his expression grim, his huge frame blocking out the sun. He did not need to touch him. His presence was enough. Go, Silas commanded, his voice a low, final judgment. Tell the Reverend Miller and the good people of Providence that this family and this mountain are under my protection. If you ever come back, I will not be so merciful. Jennings and his men scrambled onto their horses, their retreat a panicked, graceless spectacle. They fled into the woods, the sounds of their departure swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the forest. The threat was gone. In the aftermath, the clearing felt unnervously quiet, the air still humming with the violence that had just passed. Alara's legs felt weak, her body trembling with residual adrenaline. The children were clinging to her dress, their faces pale. Silas stood in the center of the yard, his back to them, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. He was a titan, a force of nature who had shielded them from the cruelty of the world. He turned slowly, his eyes finding hers. The ferocity of the protector was gone, replaced by a quiet, questioning vulnerability. He had laid claim to them, called them his family in front of their enemies. Now, in the quiet, the weight of those words settled between them. She walked towards him, the children still trailing behind her. She stopped just before him, her gaze meeting his. There were no words for what had just happened, no way to articulate the profound shift that had occurred. He had not just defended a piece of land. He had defended their lives, their future, their very existence as a unit. He had named them his. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and laid it on his forearm. It was the first time she had touched him with deliberate tenderness, not as a nurse tending a patient, but as a partner. His skin was warm, the muscles beneath hard as oak. His gaze dropped to her hand, then rose again to meet her eyes. 1,000 unspoken emotions passed between them in that look. Gratitude, respect, a shared understanding of the bond that had been forged in sickness, sealed in trust, and now tempered in conflict. He covered her hand with his own massive one, his touch surprisingly gentle, enveloping her completely. It was an affirmation, an acceptance, promise. Behind them, Caleb stepped forward, his young face resolute. He looked up at the giant of a man who had defended his family. "Pa!" he said, the word now solid, certain. "Your axe is still in the block." Silas looked from Alara to the boy, and for the first time, a true, small smile touched the corners of his mouth, softening the harsh lines of his face. "So it is, son," he rumbled. "So it is." The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing and bathing the small cabin in a warm, golden light. The world was still a hard and unforgiving place, but within this small circle of light, they were safe. They were no longer for disparate souls clinging to survival, but a family, standing together on their mountain, ready to face whatever came next. The long winter of their solitude was over.